Dear listeners, welcome. Deep within the rainforests of Central America lie silent cities. Great stone pyramids rise above the jungle canopy, their plazas and temples choked by the roots of ancient trees. For centuries, this was a forgotten world, a mystery known only to the local communities who lived in the shadow of their sleeping stone ancestors. This was the world of the classic Maya, a civilization that, at its height, stood among the most advanced societies on Earth. They developed the only complete writing system in the ancient Americas, created calendars of breathtaking accuracy, and observed the movements of the stars with extraordinary precision for centuries. They were a people of divine kings, strange and often brutal rituals, and magnificent art. And then, in the very heart of their southern homelands, they vanished not overnight, but through a slow and mysterious unraveling, one that led to the abandonment of their greatest cities and a rapid decline in their population. Why this happened remains one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries. Tonight, we journey into the world of these silent cities to investigate their fall. We will explore their golden age and then, like archaeologists, examine the clues left behind in stone and soil. Clues that point toward a perfect storm of endemic warfare, catastrophic drought, and human-driven environmental collapse. Before we begin this mysterious journey, please don't forget to like the video and subscribe. It is the simplest way to support our work and truly the best reward for the effort behind these stories. If you'd like, you can also tell us in the comments where in the world you are watching from and what time it is where you are, so we can get to know our listeners a little better. With this video, I invite you to step away from the chaos of the modern world and follow me into the deep, green mysteries of the ancient jungle. For centuries, the great stone cities of the Maya lay asleep beneath the emerald embrace of the Central American rainforest. To the outside world, they did not exist. Vague rumors and scattered reports from Spanish missionaries and local woodsmen spoke of strange stone idols and vast, collapsed palaces hidden deep within the jungle. These accounts were largely dismissed as fantasy. The prevailing belief of the 19th century was that no great indigenous civilization could have arisen in the Americas. If the ruins were real at all, they were assumed to be the work of Egyptians, a lost tribe of Israel, or some other foreign race. The men who would shatter this prejudice were an extraordinary pair. One was John Lloyd Stevens, an American lawyer, diplomat, and celebrated travel writer, with an insatiable curiosity for the forgotten corners of the world. The other was Frederick Catherwood, a remarkably talented British architect and artist, gifted with a meticulous eye for detail and a steady, disciplined hand. In 1839, drawn by whispers of lost cities, they set out on an expedition into the largely unmapped and politically unstable jungles of Honduras and Guatemala. Their journey was grueling. They traveled by mule through dense, suffocating rainforest, battling insects, mud, and torrential rain. Caught in the chaos of a regional civil war, they were forced to negotiate safe passage with suspicious, heavily armed local generals. Still, they pressed on. Following a local guide, they eventually arrived at a site near the Copan River in Honduras. Cutting through the thick undergrowth with machetes, they emerged into a clearing. What they saw would change the course of history. Rising from the jungle floor stood magnificent stone monuments, towering steely carved from top to bottom, with the portraits of enigmatic royal kings and intricate geometric symbols unlike anything they had ever seen before. Architect Frederick Catherwood was astonished by the quality of the artwork, immediately recognizing it as the product of a culture as sophisticated as ancient Egypt or Greece. But it was John Lloyd Stevens who grasped its true significance. These were not the works of a foreign people. They were the unique, powerful, and entirely forgotten legacy of an indigenous American civilization. Stevens was so convinced of the site's importance that he famously purchased the entire ruined city from its bewildered owner for just $50. As Stevens began recording their journey in detailed journals, Catherwood set to work with meticulous discipline. In the sweltering heat, his hands swollen from insect bites, he used a device known as a camera lucida to project the carvings onto paper. This allowed him to capture their complex details with a level of accuracy never before achieved. His striking illustrations were not romantic fantasies. They were precise architectural and artistic records, the first true visual documentation of the Maya world ever seen by the public. Their journey continued, revealing one marvel after another. They explored the elegant multi-storied palace of Palenque in Mexico, where delicate stucco reliefs emerged from the jungle mist. They reached the colossal ruins of Tikal in Guatemala, where the tallest stone pyramids in the ancient Americas rose like man-made mountains, their summits piercing the vast green canopy of the rainforest. When Stevens published incidents of travel in Central America, Chiapas, and Yucatan, illustrated with Catherwood's breathtaking drawings, it became an international sensation. The book proved beyond doubt that a great and sophisticated civilization had risen and fallen in the Americas long before the arrival of Columbus. The silent cities had been found. The world now knew they existed, but a deeper mystery had been revealed. Who were the people who built these magnificent cities, and why had they abandoned them to the jungle? The discoveries of Stevens and Catherwood opened a window onto a new and complex world. What emerged from the archaeological work that followed was the portrait of a civilization that, for more than 6 centuries, roughly from 250 to 900 AD, dominated the intellectual and artistic landscape of ancient America. This was the classic Maya civilization. It is essential to understand that the Maya were not a single, unified empire ruled from one great capital. Their world was a dynamic and often unstable network of dozens of independent city-states, each controlling its own territory and competing for power and influence. Great cities such as Tikal and Palenque rivaled Copan and the mighty serpent kingdom of Calakmul. The history we can now read from their stone monuments tells a story of constantly shifting alliances, strategic royal marriages, and intense ritual warfare. At the foundation of this entire civilization stood a single plant, maize or corn. It was maize that built the great pyramids and sustained the complex Maya society. The Maya were, quite literally, the people of maize. It was not merely their primary source of food. It lay at the very heart of their religion and their identity. Their entire existence was a partnership with this vital crop. Growing maize in the thin soils and unpredictable rainfall of a tropical rainforest was a constant struggle. To survive, the Maya developed ingenious agricultural techniques, from slash-and-burn farming in small forest plots to the construction of elaborate hillside terraces and raised, irrigated fields in swampy lowlands. The cycle of planting, growth, and harvest was not simply labor. It was sacred drama, the central ritual of life itself. At the heart of this sacred drama stood the king, the Kuholajaw, the Holy Lord. The Maya king was not merely a political ruler or military commander. He was a divine shaman king, the living bridge between the mortal world of his people and the supernatural realm of the gods and royal ancestors. His primary duty was not governance, but ritual. Ceremonies that maintained cosmic order, ensured the daily rising of the sun, and above all, brought the seasonal cycles that allowed the maize to grow. To fulfill this sacred duty, the king offered his most powerful sacrifice, his own blood. In solemn ceremonies, the Ajah performed bloodletting rituals. Using razor-sharp obsidian blades, stingray spines, or sharpened bone, he pierced his tongue, earlobes, or other parts of his body, allowing his blood to drip onto strips of paper held in a vessel. This paper was then burned, and it was believed that within the rising smoke a portal would open, a vision serpent through which the king could communicate with the gods and ancestors, pleading for the survival of his people. This was the essence of the great cosmic bargain at the heart of Maya civilization. The people sustained the king with tribute drawn from their maize fields. In return, the king nourished the gods with his sacred blood. As long as this exchange endured, the universe remained in balance. Cities flourished, and the maize continued to grow. It was a powerful and deeply rooted belief system, yet one built upon a fragile and dangerous promise that human devotion, embodied in the king, could command even the sky itself. For decades after their rediscovery, the silent cities of the Maya guarded their deepest secrets. The intricate carvings that covered their monuments and temples posed a profound riddle. Scholars viewed them not as a language, but as a mysterious collection of symbolic images and decorative motifs. It was widely believed that the true story of the Maya had been lost forever. They were wrong. Hidden within these beautiful and complex carvings was a voice, the only true writing system ever developed in ancient America, waiting to be understood. Once deciphered, it would finally allow the silent cities to tell their own history. Unlike a simple alphabet, Maya writing was a sophisticated and elegant logosyllabic system. Some glyphs represented entire words, while others conveyed phonetic syllables. A scribe could write the same word in multiple ways, either as a single complex pictorial glyph or spelled out syllable by syllable. These glyphs were expertly arranged into square blocks, and the texts were written in paired columns, read in a zigzag pattern from left to right and from top to bottom. For centuries, this complexity rendered the script unreadable, making it appear more like an art form than a language. The key to their writing, and indeed to their entire worldview, lay in their advanced mathematical systems. The Maya developed a vigesimal or base 20 numerical system of remarkable elegance and simplicity. A single dot represented 1, a horizontal bar represented 5, and a stylized shell symbol represented a concept of pure genius for its time, 0. The independent invention of 0 was an extraordinary intellectual leap, one that many great civilizations, including the Romans, never achieved. For the Maya, it was an indispensable tool, allowing calculations that reached into the millions and enabling them to track vast cycles of time with astonishing precision. For the Maya, time itself was a sacred obsession. They did not rely on a single calendar. Instead, they used a complex, interlocking series of systems that governed every aspect of life. The first was the Tsokin, a 260-day sacred calendar used for divination and religious ceremonies. Running alongside it was the Hab, a 365-day solar calendar that regulated agricultural seasons. Together, these calendars meshed like intricate gears, creating a larger 52-year cycle. To record events across even greater spans of time, the Maya developed the long count, a linear and astonishingly accurate tally of days elapsed since a mythical creation date in 3114 BCE. It is this long count, carved into stone monuments, that allows modern archaeologists to date the reigns of Maya kings and the histories of their cities with a level of precision unmatched in the ancient world. This mastery of mathematics and timekeeping arose from deep, patient observation of the cosmos. Maya priest astronomers tracked celestial movements from observatories built atop their pyramids. They could predict the motions of the sun, moon, and planets with remarkable accuracy. They foresaw solar and lunar eclipses, events they regarded as powerful and often dangerous omens. They were especially obsessed with the cycles of Venus, which they closely associated with warfare and sacred ritual. Hieroglyphs, mathematics, calendars, and astronomy were all part of a single unified quest to understand the divine order of the universe. The Maya did not see the cosmos as a realm of chaos, but as a vast, intricate, and predictable machine governed by repeating cycles of time. Their greatest intellectual task was to decipher its workings and align their society with its sacred rhythms through precise ritual and meticulous record-keeping. For them, the universe was a text written in the language of the stars, and they were its devoted and perceptive readers. At its peak, around 750 CE, the world of the classic Maya must have seemed eternal. The great city-states of the southern lowlands were thriving. With its towering temple pyramids, Tikal was a bustling metropolis. The kings of the mighty serpent kingdom of Calakmul ruled over a vast network of vassal states. In Köpen, master artisans were carving some of the most intricate and beautiful monuments in all of ancient America. Population levels were at their peak. Traditions were strong, and the complex gears of the sacred calendar seemed to promise a predictable, divinely ordered future. But this was the high point, just before a long and mysterious decline. The first sign that something had gone deeply wrong was written in stone, or rather, in the sudden absence of writing. For centuries, Maya kings had obsessively recorded their reigns, dedicating magnificent carved stone monuments to mark important dates and military victories. Thanks to their precise long count calendar, we can follow this history with astonishing accuracy. And it is this accuracy that allows us to witness the unraveling as it happened. From the late 8th century onward, cities began to fall silent, one by one. At Palenque, the last dated monument records the year 799 CE. At Copan, 822 CE. In the former superpower city of Tikal, the final great monument dates to 869 CE. After this point, a tradition that had defined Maya civilization for centuries simply vanished. The monuments stopped. Kings were no longer commissioning these public declarations of power. This sudden silence in the archaeological record is chilling evidence of a system in crisis. The public voice of the divine kings was being extinguished. Further signs of societal collapse were found at the very heart of the cities themselves. Archaeologists uncovered massive construction projects mysteriously left unfinished, new temples, expanded palaces, and grand ceremonial causeways abandoned mid-build. They are ghostly places, vast plazas only partially paved, carefully carved stone blocks, left behind in quarries and along roadways. It is as if stonemasons and laborers simply laid down their tools one day and walked away. The engine of Maya's civilization was grinding to a halt. In these final desperate years, the character of the cities began to change. In some places, we see evidence of crude defensive walls hastily built around central palaces and temples, a stark contrast to the open, confident designs of the classic period. This was a world suddenly living in fear. At the same time, a clear decline appears in the quality of elite goods, from painted ceramics to finely carved jade. The sophisticated trade networks that once supplied the cities with luxury items were clearly collapsing, and the number of skilled artisans was dwindling. It is also crucial to understand that this was not a single event that affected all Maya people equally. The collapse was concentrated in the great ancient cities of the southern lowlands, the traditional heartland of the civilization. As Tikal and Calakmul were dying, cities in the northern Yucatan Peninsula, such as Chichen Itza, were in fact entering a new period of growth and influence, the final brilliant chapter of Maya culture. But in the south, the evidence is undeniable. Over a period of roughly 150 years, great cities that had stood for centuries were emptied. A civilization that had flourished for more than 600 years saw its people vanish from their magnificent homes. The silence of abandoned temples and the final dates carved into stone raise a haunting question, one that has troubled historians and archaeologists for more than a century. What happened here? Why did they leave? As archaeologists began to decipher Maya writing and piece together the histories of the great southern cities, a dramatic and violent picture emerged. For centuries, warfare had been an integral part of Maya civilization, but it was a conflict with a very particular character. For much of the classic period, Maya warfare was highly ritualized and limited in scope. The goal was rarely the conquest of vast territories or the destruction of entire populations. Instead, the objective was the capture of rival kings and high-ranking nobles. These elite captives were brought back to the victor city, where they were publicly humiliated, tortured, and ultimately sacrificed in grand religious ceremonies, acts meant to appease the gods and demonstrate the power of the victorious king or dynasty. But in the final century of the classic period, as the unraveling began, the evidence suggests that the nature of warfare itself was changing. Art carved into stone monuments and painted on palace walls grows darker and more chaotic. The earlier orderly depictions, scenes of a single king triumphantly capturing a rival lord, give way to far more desperate images. Something fundamental had shifted. Massed armies clash in the jungle. Warriors draped in terrifying jaguar pelts and towering feathered headdresses battle atop wooden palisades, while dozens of bound, helpless captives are presented for judgment. The most vivid and infamous depiction of this violence comes from the magnificent murals of Bonampak. Here, brutal warfare unfolds in graphic detail, followed by a harrowing scene in which captured nobles are tortured, their fingernails torn out, before their final sacrifice. This artistic shift is confirmed by the evidence in the ground itself. In cities such as Tikal, once open and self-assured, archaeologists have uncovered the remains of hastily constructed defensive walls and ditches surrounding central temples and palaces. These were not the carefully planned fortifications of a militarized state, but desperate last measures of a society suddenly living in fear. In some regions, excavations have revealed mass graves filled with skeletons bearing clear signs of violent death, evidence of large-scale conflict far beyond the ritual capture of a few elites. The most detailed picture of this escalating violence comes from Guatemala's Petexbaden region. Here, a royal dynasty based in the city of Dos Pilas launched an aggressive campaign of expansionist warfare against its neighbors. For a time, they were successful, carving out a small empire. But their aggression ultimately backfired, triggering a deadly spiral of retaliatory conflicts that consumed the entire region. The final capital, Aguatica, was abandoned so rapidly in the face of attack that half-eaten meals were left in kitchens and valuable possessions lay scattered across house floors. This leads to the first major theory explaining the Maya collapse. The highly ritualized endemic warfare that had long been a stable component of their political system spiraled out of control. A chain of escalating conflicts created a domino effect. Constant warfare made it impossible for farmers to tend their fields, leading to food shortages. Vital trade routes, bringing essential goods such as salt and obsidian, were disrupted. As kings began to lose wars and fail to protect their people, faith in royal authority eroded. The entire system of divine kingship began to collapse. The intensifying wars between Maya city-states paint a dramatic and violent picture of the final centuries of the classic period. Yet they do not fully answer the deeper question: why did the violence spiral out of control? A growing body of scientific evidence suggests that the Maya were not only fighting one another, they were also losing a war against their own environment, one born from the very success of their civilization. This theory proposes that the collapse was, in effect, a self-inflicted wound. At the heart of the Maya world, the tropical rainforest is a deceptive landscape. It appears eternally lush and fertile, yet in reality its soils are remarkably thin and easily exhausted. Supporting a large, dense population in this environment required exceptional agricultural engineering and careful management. For centuries, the Maya mastered this challenge, using sophisticated techniques such as terracing and raised fields to sustain their growing cities. But when the population peaked in the 8th century, the pressure on the land became immense. The first great demand was food. A single city like Tikal may have housed over 60,000 people, requiring vast tracts of surrounding forest to be cleared for maize, beans, and squash. The second, and perhaps even greater, demand was architecture. The magnificent Maya pyramids and palaces were not bare stone. They were coated in thick, smooth, brilliant white lime plaster, often vividly painted. Producing this plaster required quarrying limestone and burning it at extremely high temperatures. The only available fuel for this process was enormous quantities of green wood. Archaeologists have calculated the staggering environmental cost of this architectural tradition. To produce the lime plaster for just one of Tikal's Great Pyramids would have required the clearing of approximately 1,000 acres of virgin forest. As rival kings competed in an architectural arms race, each striving to outdo the others with ever more magnificent temples to the gods and monuments to their own glory, the rate of deforestation would have accelerated dramatically. In the centuries leading up to the collapse, the landscape surrounding the great cities likely transformed from dense rainforest into a patchwork of maize fields and bare, treeless slopes. This widespread deforestation must have triggered a devastating chain of consequences. Without the complex root systems of trees to hold the thin topsoil in place, intense seasonal rains would have washed the soil into rivers and wetlands, destroying the fertility of agricultural land. Large-scale deforestation may also have altered the local climate itself, reducing the amount of moisture retained in the soil and released into the atmosphere, potentially making critical dry seasons longer and more severe. And of course, the loss of the forest meant the loss of vital resources upon which the Maya depended in their daily lives. Game animals for hunting, wood for construction and cooking, and a wide range of medicinal plants. Evidence of this environmental degradation is written into the mud at the bottom of the region's lakes. By drilling deep into these lake beds, scientists can analyze ancient pollen trapped within layers of sediment. In the layers corresponding to the late Classic period, they observe a dramatic decline in tree pollen and a sharp rise in weed pollen, clear indicators of widespread deforestation. At the same time, the sediment layers themselves grow thicker, formed by eroded soil washed down from surrounding hillsides. The very hallmarks of the classic Maya civilization, its large, dense populations and its monumental, dazzling white cities, appear to have sown the seeds of its collapse. By pushing their fragile tropical environment beyond its limits, they created a civilization balanced on a knife's edge, with no margin for error. In a sense, they inflicted a deep wound upon their own world, leaving it weakened and vulnerable to the final, fatal blows yet to come. The combined story of endemic warfare and self-inflicted environmental damage reveals a classic Maya civilization that had become dangerously unstable. Its foundations were stretched to the breaking point. But to find the final decisive force that likely shattered their world, we must look to the sky. Maya civilization was built upon a single fundamental agreement, a pact with rain. Their entire agricultural system depended on predictable seasonal downpours to fill vast artificial reservoirs and nourish maize fields. For centuries, this agreement held. But in the final years of the Classic period, the skies fell silent. For a long time, the idea of a catastrophic drought was only one theory among many, supported by little direct evidence. In recent decades, however, a new generation of scientists, working like historical detectives, has found ways to read the climate of the distant past. They have discovered natural archives that meticulously record annual rainfall over thousands of years. To be why drilling deep into the lake beds of the Yucatan Peninsula, researchers extract long sediment cores. Within the layers of mud, they measure concentrations of gypsum, a mineral that precipitates in greater quantities during dry years, leaving a clear chemical signature of drought. In the region's vast underground cave systems, an even more precise record exists. Here, water dripping from cave ceilings over thousands of years has formed massive, still pools and stone formations. Like the rings of a tree, these mineral structures grow in microscopic layers. By analyzing the oxygen isotopes trapped within each layer, paleoclimatologists can reconstruct ancient weather patterns with astonishing, near-monthly precision. When these two independent records, from lake beds and caves, were finally cross-referenced, they told the same unmistakable story. The scientific data show that the greatest period of growth for the Classic Maya, between roughly 300 and 600 CE, coincided with an era of unusually high and consistent rainfall. This favorable climate allowed populations to expand rapidly and great cities to flourish. But then, as the southern cities began to unravel around 750 CE, the climate shifted dramatically. The region entered a centuries-long period of severe aridity, punctuated by multiple catastrophic megadroughts, unlike anything the civilization had previously experienced. The impact would have been apocalyptic. The carefully engineered reservoirs that were the pride of cities like Tikal would have slowly evaporated, turning into vast expanses of cracked, sun-baked mud, endless plains of desolation. The maize fields, the foundation of their entire society, failed season after season, triggering catastrophic famine and widespread malnutrition. Even the forest, which had always appeared eternally lush, began to wither. Water levels dropped, and even the sacred sinkholes, the cenotes, ran dry. Great cities, home to tens of thousands, were transformed into death traps, places of hunger and thirst. This powerful body of scientific evidence offers the most compelling explanation for the collapse. Warfare and deforestation had already weakened the Maya, reducing their ability to respond to crisis. The catastrophic, centuries-long shift in climate likely delivered the final, unavoidable blows. Divine kings, whose authority rested entirely on their claimed ability to bring rain through sacred bloodletting rituals, performed ever more desperate ceremonies. But the sky remained silent. As leadership faltered, faith in the system that governed society began to erode. Centuries of belief unraveled, triggering the complete social collapse we see reflected in the abandoned, silent cities. The mystery of the classic Maya collapse does not have a single, simple answer. There was no lone cause that brought down this extraordinary civilization. Instead, modern science and archaeology reveal a far more complex and tragic story. A perfect storm in which a series of interconnected crises fed into one another, creating a cascading failure from which the Maya of the southern lowlands could not recover. The foundations of disaster had been laid over centuries. As we have seen, the success of the classic Maya and their competitive temple building led to widespread deforestation and the erosion of fragile soils. By pushing their environment to its absolute limits, they created a brilliant but brittle civilization, one living permanently on an environmental knife's edge. Into this vulnerable world came a century-long period of catastrophic drought, beginning around 750 CE. The seasonal rains the Maya had relied upon for 1,000 years became unreliable, and then collapsed entirely. Vast reservoirs dried up, and the maize fields that sustained their society withered, unleashing widespread and devastating famine. Confronted with a crisis their ancestors could never have imagined, the divine kings and elites responded in the only way they knew. They turned to war, seeking resources and attempting to appease gods they believed had turned against them. But these were no longer the traditional, ritualized conflicts of the past. This was desperate, total warfare. A brutal struggle between starving cities for control of the last fertile lands and reliable water sources. This response only accelerated the catastrophe in a deadly feedback loop. Constant warfare drove farmers from their fields, worsening famine. Trade routes that once supplied essential goods collapsed. The countryside became a landscape of terror, forcing populations to flee their homes and seek refuge behind hastily built defensive walls. The more desperate conditions became, the more the wars intensified, and the deeper the desperation grew. This brings us to the final and fatal stage of collapse, the twilight of the gods. The Maya king's entire political and religious authority rested on a single sacred promise, that through ritual and blood sacrifice, he could maintain cosmic order and guarantee rain and harvests. As drought followed drought, year after agonizing year, and endless wars delivered only more death and suffering, that promise was broken. The rituals had failed. The gods were not listening. People starving and living in fear lost faith not only in their kings, but in the entire system of divine kingship, and in the gods themselves. The social contract that had bound their world together for centuries simply dissolved. Faced with hunger, endless war, and the collapse of both political and religious authority, ordinary people made the only rational choice left to them. They voted with their feet. They abandoned the great stone cities and the sacred lords who had failed them, returning to smaller, scattered, more sustainable ways of life, melting back into the forest. The end of the classic Maya world in the southern lowlands was not a single, fiery apocalypse. It was a slow, quiet, profoundly sorrowful fading. The great cities were not conquered and burned by foreign enemies. They were simply emptied. Over the course of roughly a century and a half, generations of people made a collective, heartbreaking decision. They left. We can imagine the impossible choice faced by a single family. Their ancestors had lived for generations in the shadow of Tikal's Great Pyramids, farming small plots of land and offering maize to the divine king. But now the rains had failed again. The reservoirs were dry. The maize stalks stood brittle and barren. The king's rituals and blood sacrifices produced nothing but empty promises. Endless wars brought only fear and misery. And so, one night, they gathered the few belongings they could carry and turned their backs on the stone temples that had defined their world. They vanished into the forest, searching for a new life where maize might still grow. The archaeological record shows this story repeated hundreds of thousands of times. Evidence suggests that the great ceremonial centers and royal palaces were the first places abandoned. In some cities, for a brief time, ordinary people moved into empty plazas and elite residences, lighting simple cooking fires on finely plastered floors, squatters living among the ruins of their gods and kings. But eventually, they too were driven away by the same relentless pressures of drought and famine. And as the last people departed, the forest, held at bay for centuries, began its slow, patient return. First, wind carried seeds into the cracks of vast empty plazas. Small plants took root, their shoots breaking through plastered surfaces. Then the powerful roots of great ceiba and ramon trees began their relentless work, undermining temple foundations and tearing them apart. Stone stairways collapsed. Carved monuments of kings toppled. Over centuries, everything was swallowed by thick, green vegetation. Towering pyramids once visible for miles away became indistinguishable from natural hills, their sharp stone lines softened and buried beneath soil and trees. Vast plazas where thousands once gathered for ceremonies turned into quiet, shaded clearings on the forest floor. The roar of crowds in ball courts was replaced by the echoing calls of howler monkeys. The sounds of human life, chanting priests and bustling markets, gave way to the hum of insects and the rustle of leaves. The cities fell silent. For nearly 1,000 years, the great centers of classic Maya civilization remained hidden from the outside world. Their history, science, and art slept beneath the forest canopy. Memory of who they were survived only in the oral traditions of scattered, descendant communities who had built simpler lives within the jungle. To the rest of the world, it was as if they had never existed. They waited silently for explorers in a distant future to stumble upon these green hills and rediscover the lost world sleeping beneath. The story of the classic Maya collapse in the south, with its silent cities and abandoned plazas, is one of dramatic decline. But it is not the end of the Maya story. Collapse was not extinction. It was transformation. As the great urban centers of the southern rainforests emptied, the center of gravity of the Maya world shifted northward, leading to a final, brilliant flowering of their culture. On the flatter, drier lands of the Yucatan Peninsula, a new generation of cities not only survived but flourished, reaching their height as their southern cousins were reclaimed by the forest. The greatest and most magnificent of these was Chichen Itza. Its art and architecture were unmistakably Maya, yet infused with a new, cosmopolitan spirit shaped by strong influences from central Mexico. This was a city of warriors and merchants defined by power. Here rose the iconic feathered serpent god Kukulkan, along with the largest ball court in ancient America, the majestic pyramid temple known as El Castillo, and a vast temple of the warriors surrounded by hundreds of carved stone columns. These northern cities thrived because they adapted. Rather than relying entirely on unpredictable rainfall for intensive maize agriculture, they anchored their power in a robust maritime trade network. The vast maize fields that formed the foundation of entire societies had failed season after season, triggering catastrophic famine and widespread malnutrition. Even the forests, once seemingly eternally green, began to wither. Water levels fell, and even the sacred sinkhole wells, the cenotes, ran dry. Great cities that had once supported tens of thousands of inhabitants became death traps, places of hunger and thirst. This powerful body of scientific evidence offers the most compelling explanation for the collapse. Rising warfare and widespread deforestation had already weakened the Maya people, eroding their ability to withstand crisis. Against this backdrop, a catastrophic century-long shift in climate likely delivered the final and unavoidable blows. Divine King Zajau, whose authority rested entirely on sacred bloodletting rituals and their claimed ability to summon rain, responded with ever more desperate ceremonies. But the sky remained silent. As leadership failed, so too did the people's faith in the system that governed them. Ways of life sustained for centuries unraveled, triggering the complete societal collapse visible today in silent, abandoned cities. The mystery of the classic Maya collapse does not have a single, simple explanation. No lone cause brought this magnificent civilization to ruin. Instead, modern science and archaeology reveal a far more complex and tragic story. A perfect storm in which a series of interconnected crises fed into one another, creating a chain of failure from which the Maya of the southern lowlands could not recover. The foundations of disaster had been laid centuries earlier. As we have seen, the success of the classic Maya and their competitive temple-building culture drove widespread deforestation and the erosion of fragile soils. By pushing their environment to its absolute limits, they created a brilliant yet precarious civilization, one living permanently on an environmental knife edge. Into this vulnerable world came a century of catastrophic drought, beginning around 750 CE. The seasonal rains upon which the Maya had depended for over 1,000 years became unreliable, then collapsed altogether. Vast water reservoirs dried up. The maize fields, the backbone of their society, failed, unleashing devastating famine. Confronted with a crisis their ancestors could never have imagined, the divine kings of the Maya responded in the only way they knew. They turned to war, seeking resources and attempting to appease the angry gods they believed were blocking their reign. But these were no longer the traditional, ritualized conflicts of the past. This was desperate, total war, a brutal struggle between starving cities for control of the last fertile lands and reliable water sources. This response only accelerated the catastrophe through a deadly feedback loop. Constant warfare drove farmers from their fields, deepening famine. Trade routes that once carried essential goods were shattered. The countryside became a landscape of terror, forcing populations to flee their homes and seek refuge behind hastily built fortifications. The more desperate conditions became, the more war intensified. And the more war raged, the more desperate the situation grew. This brings us to the final and fatal stage of collapse, the twilight of the gods. All political and religious authority of the Maya king rested on a single sacred promise, that through ritual and blood sacrifice, he could maintain cosmic order and guarantee rain and harvest. As droughts stretched into year after agonizing year, and endless warfare delivered only death and misery, that sacred promise collapsed. The king's rituals had failed. The gods were not listening. Starving and terrorized, the people lost faith not only in their rulers, but in the entire system of divine kingship, and in the gods themselves. The social contract that had bound their world together for centuries simply dissolved. Faced with famine, relentless war, and a failed political and religious order, ordinary people made the only rational choice left to them. They voted with their feet. They abandoned the great stone cities and the sacred lords who had failed them, returning instead to smaller, scattered, and more sustainable ways of life, melting back into the forest. The end of the classic Maya world in the southern lowlands was not a single fiery apocalypse. It was a slow, silent, profoundly sorrowful fading. The great cities were not, for the most part, conquered and burned by foreign enemies. They were simply emptied. Over roughly a century and a half, generation after generation made the same desperate decision. They left. This was the Great Migration. We can imagine the impossible choice faced by a single family. For generations, their ancestors had lived in the shadow of the Great Pyramids of Tikal, farming their small plots and offering maize to the divine king. But now the rains had failed again. The city's reservoirs were dry. The maize stalks withered, barren. The king's rituals and blood sacrifices produced nothing but empty promises. Endless wars with rival cities brought only fear and suffering. And so one night, they gathered what few possessions remained and turned their backs on the stone temples that had defined their lives. They left everything behind, disappearing into the forest in search of a new beginning. Somewhere maize might still grow. The archaeological record shows this story repeated hundreds of thousands of times. Evidence suggests that the great ceremonial centers and royal palaces were the first to be abandoned. In some cities, for a time, ordinary people occupied empty plazas and grand residences, lighting crude cooking fires on finely plastered floors, living as squatters in the ruined homes of gods and kings. Eventually, they too departed, driven out by the same relentless pressures of drought and famine. And as the last people left, the forest, held at bay for centuries, began its slow, patient return. Wind carried seeds into the cracks of vast plazas. Small plants took root, their shoots breaking through plastered surfaces. Then the mighty roots of great ceiba and ramon trees began their relentless work, weakening temple foundations, tearing them apart. Stone stairways collapsed. Carved monuments of kings toppled. Over centuries, everything was swallowed beneath thick green vegetation. Towering pyramids, once visible from kilometers away, became indistinguishable from natural hills. Their sharp stone lines softened and buried beneath earth and trees. Broad ceremonial plazas, once filled with thousands, became quiet, shaded clearings on the forest floor. The roar of crowds in ball courts was replaced by the haunting calls of howler monkeys. The sounds of human life, chanting priests and bustling markets, gave way to insects buzzing and leaves whispering. The cities fell silent. For nearly 1,000 years, the great centers of classic Maya civilization lay hidden from the outside world. Their histories, sciences, and art slept beneath the jungle canopy. Memory of what they had been survived only in the oral traditions of scattered descendant communities who had built new, simpler lives within the forest. To the rest of the world, it was as if they had never existed. Silently, the Green Hills waited for future explorers who would one day stumble upon them and rediscover the lost world sleeping beneath. The story of the classic Maya collapse in the south, its silent cities and abandoned plazas, is one of dramatic decline. But it is not the end of the Maya story. Collapse was not extinction. It was transformation. As the great southern rainforest cities emptied, the center of gravity of the Maya world shifted northward, giving rise to a final fluorescence of their culture. In the flatter, drier landscape of the Yucatan Peninsula, a new generation of cities not only survived, but thrived, reaching their peak as their southern cousins were reclaimed by the jungle. The greatest and most magnificent of these was Chichen Itza. Its art and architecture were unmistakably Maya, yet infused with a new cosmopolitan spirit, shaped by powerful influences from central Mexico. This was a city of warriors and traders. Northern cities dedicated to the feathered serpent god Kukulkan constructed the largest ball court in the ancient Americas, the towering pyramid of El Castillo, and vast warrior temples surrounded by hundreds of carved stone columns. These northern cities prospered because they adapted. Rather than relying entirely on unstable seasonal rains to support intensive maize agriculture, they anchored their power in robust maritime trade networks. Using massive seagoing canoes, they controlled the flow of goods, salt, fish, cotton, obsidian, along the entire coastline of the peninsula and across the wider Caribbean world. This outward-looking, resilient economic system allowed them to flourish for centuries after the southern collapse. And even after Chichen Itza and other northern cities declined, and after the brutal Spanish conquest centuries later, the Maya people endured. This is the most important part of the story. By retreating from great cities into smaller, more sustainable farming communities, and by fiercely protecting their identity, they survived their culture, languages, traditions, and deep connection to the land. Today, more than 7 million Maya people live across Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, and El Salvador. They are not the remnants of a lost civilization. They are a living, breathing people, the direct descendants of the men and women who built the Great Pyramids. Many still speak one of the 30 surviving Maya languages. In the Guatemalan highlands, women continue to weave intricate textiles rich with ancient symbolism. In Yucatan villages, some communities still practice religious rituals that blend Catholicism with deep reverence for the ancient gods of forest and maize. The classic Maya collapse, then, was not the death of a people. It was the end of a particular political and social system, one built on divine kingship and resource-hungry cities. The silent cities are not graves of an extinct race. They are abandoned capitals of a resilient people who survived by changing how they lived. The Maya story is not just an archaeological tale. It is the mystery of a lost world and a living history, a powerful testament to a culture's capacity to endure, adapt, and remember. Nearly a century after the discoveries of Stevens and Catherwood, the intricate hieroglyphs covering Maya monuments remained a deep and frustrating mystery. The dominant theory, championed by the influential British archaeologist Sir J. Eric S. Thompson, argued that the glyphs were not a true writing system. He claimed they were primarily mystical symbols, ideographic markers of time and religion, not capable of spelling words, telling stories, or recording the lives of kings and queens. For decades, this view became dogma, leaving the Maya a people without history, their monuments mute. The first crack in this wall of silence did not come from the jungles of Central America, but from a small government office in post-war Leningrad. There, a young Russian linguist named Yuri Norizov worked in near isolation. Studying books and reproductions of Maya texts, he made a revolutionary claim. The hieroglyphs were not merely pictures, but a mixed system that was largely phonetic, representing the sounds of a spoken Maya language. Published in the 1950s, his work was brilliant but largely ignored or mocked by Western scholars loyal to Thompson's theories. The door to the Maya past remained closed. The person who finally forced it open was not a linguist, but a brilliant architect and draftsman named Tatiana Proskoryakov. Having fled the Russian Revolution as a child, she spent years producing stunningly detailed reconstructions of Maya cities. Her work required meticulous study of monument carvings. While analyzing a series of stelae from Piedras Negras, she noticed a recurring pattern. The dates on a single monument spanned roughly 60 to 80 years, the length of a human life. In an instant, she understood. These were not astronomical cycles. They were human histories. She realized the earliest dates marked births, later dates recorded accessions to the throne, and the final date marked the king's death. In a groundbreaking 1960 paper, Proskoryakov proved beyond doubt that Maya stelae were historical biographies, recording the lives and deeds of named rulers. Her discovery tore the door from its hinges. It overturned decades of dogma and confirmed Norizov's phonetic approach. With this new understanding, a new generation of scholars made astonishing progress. The gates opened. The names of great rulers from Palenque and Tikal emerged from stone. Complex political histories, wars, alliances, royal marriages became readable. The decipherment of Maya writing stands as one of the great intellectual achievements of the 20th century. It transformed our view of the Maya from a mystical civilization of peaceful stargazers into a fully human world of political drama, ambition, and violence. The silent cities could finally tell their own story in their own words. We began this journey with mystery, the image of magnificent stone cities lying silent in the heart of the jungle. We traced their story from the golden age of classic Maya civilization through the complex and painful process of collapse. We followed the clues left in soil and stone, escalating warfare, a fragile environment pushed to its limits, and finally a sky that refused to give rain. Now we hold a powerful picture of how this great civilization unraveled. Yet the story of the silent cities continues to resonate, not only because of the mystery of their fall, but because of the lessons their echoes carry across centuries. The first is a cautionary tale. The story of the classic Maya collapse reminds us of the fragility of even the most advanced civilizations. For centuries, their success rested on a brilliant but precarious system. As populations grew, kings reached ever higher with monumental pyramids, supported by an agricultural system pushing the limits of a harsh tropical environment. Their deep faith that sacred rituals and divine rulers could control nature was shattered by a force beyond their control: catastrophic long-term climate change. Their story is a timeless warning about the delicate balance between human ambition and the environment that sustains it. The second echo speaks of extraordinary human resilience. The fall of the great southern cities was not the end of the Maya people. It was the end of a way of life. Migration away from urban centers was traumatic, but ultimately successful. By abandoning the unsustainable model of divine kings and resource-hungry cities, the Maya adapted and endured. They survived the southern collapse, experienced new golden ages, endured centuries of upheaval, and survived the brutal Spanish conquest. Their culture did not break. It bent, adapted, and continued. And so we are left with two legacies. The legacy of the silent cities, their towering pyramids and unresolved mysteries, bearing witness to how high a civilization can rise and how swiftly it can fall. And the living legacy of the Maya people themselves, still walking the lands of their ancestors, still speaking the languages of ancient scribes, reminding us that a culture is always more than its grandest monuments. The silent cities of the jungle are more than a historical mystery. They are a mirror, forcing us to reflect on the sustainability of our own world, our relationship with climate, and the complex, often unforeseen consequences of our choices. The Maya believed the universe moved through vast, repeating cycles of creation and destruction. Their story may be history's most powerful reminder that no civilization, no matter how great, how brilliant, or how powerful, is guaranteed to last forever. Thank you for joining me on this long journey into the past. I hope the story of this great civilization has brought the beauty and mystery of the ancient world vividly to life. I wish you a calm and peaceful day.